everybody. Welcome back to this new series on concepts in sociology. And today I plan to discuss the concept culture and how we understand this particular concept. Before I start formally the lecture, I would like to go back to some of the points that I have referred to in this series. The points being that when we look at the concept, we must not look at the concept as something which is only restricted to the textbook or as something abstract, removed and far away from our everyday lives. Culture, in fact, is a concept which is pervasive. It's part of our life. We use it every day, yet when we use the term culture in sociology, social anthropology, or any of the social sciences, there is a particular way in which we use it. There is a self-conscious awareness. A self-conscious awareness. I emphasize these terms because it is these terms which will distinguish it from the manner in which it is used in common sense terminology. You would recall in my earlier lectures, I began with the distinction between common sense understanding and sociological or social science understanding of the concept. This is particularly important in the social sciences because we use the same words which we use in our everyday lives and conversation in our discussion in the social sciences. We do not have the ways that scientists would have abbreviated words, numericals, particular kind of terms for technical terms. Our terms are linguistic terms common in common sense language, and therefore it becomes extremely important to reiterate how it is different in the social sciences and how it is used in the everyday life. You would recall that in my introductory talks on basic concepts, I repeatedly narrated the challenge that we encounter in dealing with concepts in sociology. The point that I've already mentioned, we use them in our everyday lives, we use them unself-consciously and do not reflect on their meanings, for that is how words are used and understood, taken for granted in common sense discourse. But the moment we move into the social science discussion, we do not take anything for granted. Nothing is taken for granted. Everything is critically understood as an entity that has emerged in a specific context. These words, like culture, like structure, like family, politics, state, religion, are routinely used and carry taken for granted meanings. We don't keep discussing what do I mean when I say politics, what do I mean when I say religion. It is just accepted as given, mutually comprehensible. Culture is one such term. Few of us can claim that we never use them in our parts of the world, even though the word belongs to the English language. How often have we used the word culture even when we may be speaking in Tamil or Hindi or Assamese? It has become a term which is an integral part of our lives. Few words would convey such strong emotive and cognitive associations as would culture. You would recall an earlier discussion when I had referred to the great sociologist Emily Durkheim, and Emily Durkheim had mentioned that it is a challenge in social sciences, but because people have very strong feelings regarding social institutions and certain kind of apparatuses. For example, we feel very strongly maybe about the language we speak, maybe the community that we belong to, maybe our class, maybe our caste, maybe our ethnicity, or more general terms like our culture or their culture. So when I say strong emotive and cognitive associations, we mean when we hear the word culture, we immediately have associated with certain other terms. So often we have heard the word culture being used along with prefaced by our culture, their culture, and my culture, so and so's culture, a sense of possession, a sense of belongingness. Very often in this common sense discussion, it is the difference between the our and their that is flagged off. Often the difference is not just flat-ended, but one of superiority or inferiority. Later in this lecture, I'll talk, for example, in colonized countries, as we had experienced in British colonialism, the colonial rulers often felt superior, that their culture was superior to our culture. Again, within our own society, some community or some group may feel superior to others. Now, this kind of emotive associations are, however, alien to social sciences and sociology and anthropology. The issue here is not of claim, but to understand what is common in human culture. Very often, anthropology is understood as the study of humanness, of what is common in culture and how different kinds of cultural variations occur societally, historically. So the focus is very, very different from the way we use it in our everyday conversation and the way it is discussed in the social sciences. In common sense, culture is often seen as natural. It is natural. It is natural that I may like a particular kind of food, and I don't think of it as culturally learned. It is seen also not just natural, as fixed, unchanging, organic, rooted in territory and land. However, if you look at your own family, you may find that your grandparents dress differently from you, speak a little differently from you, and may in some senses have a cultural ways, behavioral practices, belief systems which are little different from you, maybe even cultural tastes which are different from you. So whereas there is a certain dominant understanding of culture as fixed, unchanging and organic, a comparative study, and as you know, sociology is essentially comparative, you realize that while there are many things common among different cultures, the important point is to understand that culture changes, evolves, develops, transforms. In sociology and social anthropology, culture is not seen as natural. Though often dominant common sense ideas do tend to shape sociological concept, and this is something we have mentioned earlier, often the break between common sense and social science concept is not what it ought to be. So the biases or the prejudices that I may have as a member of a society or a group may creep into my sociological conceptualization. This is the reason I keep harping back that it's important to be self-aware, self-conscious, and be equipped with the tools which social sciences offer us to be much more critically aware about how we use the term. The story of culture in the social sciences is no different. Let us explore how it has been used, critiqued and reformulated in sociology and social anthropology. So just as we know that culture changes over time, yet we continue to believe that people have fixed cultures and cultures are unchanging, fixed over time periods. Similarly, we have to also understand that concepts are not God-given, they are not taken for granted, but they emerge in particular society, and as they develop, development could be because of state policies, it could be because of social movements, it could be because of intellectual reformulation, the concept gets changed. There is a lot of difficulty in defining the term culture, and people have often described it as notoriously overbroad concept. Look, it seems to have encompass everything. Everything is culture, and also notoriously ambiguous, meaning that there are different ways by which we look at culture even within the social sciences, within sociology, within social anthropology, and that is something which we will look at as we proceed in this lecture. We'll begin with a person I'm sure all of you are familiar with, E.B. Tylor. And this definition I found in my own physical classroom, that almost everybody who had some acquaintance with sociology or social anthropology knew it by heart. Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a human as a member of society. I want to draw your attention to this definition and notice one, that how culture here includes everything. Not just what we in common sense we feel, oh, culture means music, something which is very fine or refined. Culture is about artistic, or culture is about tradition. No, culture includes everything: knowledge, moral, law, customs. One point. And second, these are habits and capabilities that we acquire by being a member of a society, like the language which we speak. How do we learn it? We learn it by being a member of a family, a member of a community, a member of a linguistic group that we belong to. It is not natural, it is acquired. That's a fundamental difference between common sense ideas about culture and sociological understanding of culture. Not natural but acquired. Tyler was the first to specify that culture, and again I emphasize, is learned and acquired, not biological. Not biological. This was revolutionary against the backdrop of colonialism, racism, and social evolutionism, the dominant ideologies of the 19th century. His definition is one of the first anthropological definitions of culture. When we see culture as biological, then we tend to assume that somebody behaves like that because they are biologically supposed to behave like that. And this leads to various kinds of prejudices, one being racism, maybe sexism, maybe casteism. For example, during the colonial rulers would often say, look, the natives are lazy. The natives are lazy. They're not as hardworking and enterprising as the white people. And this is an understanding that very often became part of the cultural or the commonsensical ideas of even the colonized people. Look, we are not as smart as the white people. This is what is called a racist ideology. Likewise, you could say women are emotional, culturally emotional, they're biologically emotional, and they're biologically instinctive, and they're not rational. This was not just part of common sense ideas, but part of a lot of theoretical and political ideas of great liberal thinkers also, for example, Rousseau. So it becomes very, very important to distinguish between the biological and the cultural acquired traits of different people in specific societies. Now, I want to look at two aspects of culture: one, artifacts, one, behavior. What do we mean by this? Herskovits tells us that culture is the man-made part of the environment, and Mead says culture is the totally shared learned behavior of society or subgroup. On the external side, anthropologists have focused on artifacts and behavior. Artifacts are the kind of things you would often find in museums. Look, this is the kind of products that they weave. This is the kind of textile they manufacture. This is the clay pots that they had. This is the kind of beads that they made. This is the jewelry that they have. These are the kind of tools and instruments that were developed. So they looked at the artifacts. Artifacts not necessarily being what we associate with culture, like music or painting, but it could be mode of production, tools of production, the kind of plow, part of your car, what human beings have produced. So one, focus on artifacts. Second, behavior. How do people behave? What are their kind of behavior? And when you talked about artifacts and behavior, and I'll come to that, there is both that is tangible, which is evident, which you can see in objects, and intangible skills that we acquire. Can you hunt? How well do you hunt? How musically inclined are you? How well do you dance? Very often they seem to be biological, we don't know, but they're also very much culturally acquired. So we come to the other part, that culture is the man-made, and very often, as I've mentioned many times in my earlier lectures, that many people would use the word man instead of human because you had what would be called a kind of male-centric formation of knowledge. So culture is what is human-made, part of the environment. Like today as I speak to you, and I speak through the technology of remote satellite learning, this is culture. This is very much culture in the anthropological sense. The television that you may watch in, the computer and the laptop is very much human-made and therefore culture. And culture is shared, learned behavior. So when I first started giving online lectures, I found it very uncomfortable because I've never done it before. And as I moved in, I became a little more comfortable, but perhaps not as comfortable as the younger generation who have grown into it, learned behavior of a society. And many of the young people would remember that you feel very uncomfortable saying, why do your parents or your grandparents, why are they so slow with the smartphone? Why are they so hesitant to use technology? Well, because culture is shared and learned of a society or a subgroup, and as members we belong to a particular generation who enters culture as it changes and shifts, which goes back to my earlier point that culture is not fixed, culture is changing. These dimensions are combined in, if you remember, Bronislaw Malinowski, one of the first anthropologists' formulation. Culture is a well-organized unity divided into two fundamental aspects: body of artifacts, which I told you right now what artifacts are, and a system of customs. How we do what the rituals, how do we get married, what are death practices, how do we celebrate, what do we consider sacred, what do we consider profane. All these behavioral aspects are also part of culture. Now, there was a turn, and as I said, there are intellectual turns in academics, and there was another turn in anthropology, which is called the semiotic turn. And Clifford Gibbs, one of very well-known anthropologists, obviously many decades after Malinowski, not only focused on external artifacts or external observable behavior, but took a semiotic turn. And I'll quote from Gibbs, culture is an historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols. Now you would notice here two additional words, not artifacts and behavior, but meanings which are embodied in symbols. So if I wear a nose stud, what does it symbolize? What meaning do I attribute to it? What kind of associations are associated? Emphasis on meaning, emphasis on symbol. Culture, from such a view, is like a text, something that needs to be interpreted through the investigation of symbols. So everything is not observable only by looking at how people behave or at their artifacts, because society is a cultural and meaningful entity, and meaning is very often embodied in symbols. It could be embodied the kind of symbols that we use, what we consider of particular significance in our society, and then we interpret it through the investigation. So interpretation becomes very, very crucial in this understanding of culture. So what is semiotic analysis? I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Maybe in another lecture we could emphasize on what is semiotics, but very briefly, semiotics borrows from linguistics as a model and applies linguistic concepts to other phenomena, text, and not just to language itself. In fact, the semioticians treat text as being their language in that relationship rather than things are all important. So, for example, in contemporary societies where you have, an pervasive presence of symbols and signs and advertisements and images, what kind of images evoke what. In an advertisement, what would an open sea emerge, what is symbolized as strength, what as weakness, what as romance, that each particular text is meaningful, it communicates, it evokes certain kind of feelings, and it has to be interpreted. So there, in fact, this is a whole burgeoning, field of inquiry about modern culture and culture in, say, modern media, modern advertisement, and how semiotics as a method could help understand this culture. The two fundamental aspects or insights of semiotics are that social and cultural phenomena are not just material objects or events, but the point I mentioned earlier are events with meaning and hence science. So science become very important. They do not have an essence but are defined by network of relation. What does this mean? It's very central to any semiotic analysis of culture that there is no given meaning, that black doesn't necessarily mean evil or danger. White does not necessarily mean pure. There is nothing intrinsic in the color black to denote that. But what happens is there is a network of relation which associates black maybe with danger, maybe with fear, maybe with evil, and white with virtue or purity. This is historically learned, and what gives them this meaning is the relationship that the interpreter or the member has with the symbol or sign. For Gitz, therefore, interpretation involves the production of thick descriptions in which behavioral practices are described in sufficient detail to trace inferential associations between observed events. So the argument is for people who believed in the symbolic interpretation of culture that, look, the anthropologists go to the field, write down everything, how people speak, what do they associate, what meanings do they attribute to nature, maybe to a tree, to a plant, to a father, to a mother, to maybe sunlight, to whatever, to childbirth, to marriage. And these thick description will give you the sufficient data to trace inferential associations between observed events. I will stop at this point and in the next lecture proceed with the next kind of understanding of how semiotics move to other forms of interpretation of culture. Thank you.